This episode of the Vietnam Veteran News Podcast is brought to you by Legacy Staffs, which are crafted by the Brazos Walking Stick Company in Waco, Texas. You can go to brazosticks.com and use the name MacPayne, one word, at the checkout and get 10% off your next order of the Legacy Staff or cane of your own design.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Welcome to the Vietnam Veterans News Podcast. News of interest about Vietnam veterans from a Vietnam veteran. Now here's your host, Mac Payne.
This is Mac Payne here with episode 1817 of the Vietnam Veteran News Podcast. News about the Vietnam War and the brave veterans who served there, as told to you by yours truly, a Vietnam veteran. In this episode, I'm going to talk about the mighty Mekong River. Many Vietnam veterans are familiar with this river. Thank the good Lord above, I am not familiar with it other than hearing about it from other Vietnam veterans and reading about it. I was lucky enough to spend my 2 years in Vietnam up in the Central Highlands and in the northern environs of South Vietnam, in Ai Cor. I did get close to the Mekong River once when I was down in Saigon taking care of a little business there. The Mekong River has been addressed previously in this podcast. Back in episode 1804, I talked about the Chinese damming the river up. The Chinese have constructed numerous dams on that river up in their country and Laos. That affects the flow of the river. Also talked about it back in episode 1494 and 1274, where I talked about the 9th Infantry Division Mekong Mud Dogs. Apparently, the great Mekong River today is not so great. According to some writers, it's in bad shape. If you go over to the podcast website, VietnamVeteranNews.com, episode 1817, you will see a picture of the Mekong River today. It does not look like a great river. It looks like it's about dried up. I'm going to share a story with you about that river that can give you an idea about what's happening with the mighty Mekong today. The story I'm going to share with you is titled, A River Running Out of Time, The Mighty Mekong Reduced to a Trickle. This story was written and submitted by Luke Hunt to the article. You're probably wondering, what is the article anyway, and where is it located? It is headquartered in none other than London, England. I tell you that so you know the viewpoint this story is coming from. The article is a blog site. In their mission statement, they say this: in a post-truth world, thoughtful, intelligent, well-researched analysis has never been more necessary. And at the article, they provide it. They claim they have no ideological agenda, and they promise never to tell you what to think. Their aim is simply to preserve the integrity of the free press in the UK by embracing nuance and complexity and showing the world in all its shades of gray. They claim that to read the article is to see a story from every angle. Now you know where this story comes from. Reading that mission statement should be required reading for the New York Times and the Washington Post. Sometimes they seem to have trouble with veracity. That's another subject. Right now, I need to tell you the sad and disturbing story about the Mekong River. Whenever you see a once mighty river, wherever it is, dry up to nothing, it's disturbing. To me, as a Vietnam veteran, this is an interesting situation. Let's take a look at Luke Hunt's story, again titled, A River Running Out of Time, The Mighty Mekong Reduced to a Trickle. Dateline, London, England. In his book, River of Time, by the way, That book, The River of Time, is on the recommended reading list of this podcast, VietnamVeteranNews.com. A description and a link to that book is also on the show notes for this podcast episode 1817 over at the podcast website, VietnamVeteranNews.com. Continuing. In his book, River of Time, John Swain evoked brilliantly the heady beauty of Indochina and the great Mekong Delta in the very south of Vietnam, where the river finally meets the South China Sea. He also captured the terrifying uncertainty as the Vietnam War came to an end and the Khmer Rouge marched in the Phnom Penh. He ought to be worried. As you know, the Khmer Rouge went in and murdered millions and millions of innocent Cambodians just because they did not agree with their political viewpoint. That's why we don't like communists and socialists. They should not be allowed anywhere. Hint. Continuing. The plot twists and turns against a backdrop of jungle and the fabled Mekong River, which in full flood covers an area larger than Belgium. As Swain wrote, some rivers are so still, so complacent, so dead that they leave one's heart indifferent. The Mekong is not one of them. To see it in full spate as it thunders over the Ko Kong Falls in a welter of foam in the rainy season is to know its awesome power. But the stuff of legend is fading fast. Drought and the construction of vast dams are threatening a river system that traverses 5 countries and feeds 70 million people, many of whom live hand to mouth. For a second year in a row, the Mekong River is at a record low, reduced to a trickle when it should be heading into a full flood. Water levels are down by 2/3. Rainfall for the 3 months of the current wet season is down by about 70%. Where the river meets the sea, at least 2 of 12 tributaries have closed. Salinity is creeping further inland, threatening 850 already endangered fish species. I didn't even know they had that many species of fish. Fishermen complain that their daily catch has been reduced to 1 kilogram or 2, barely enough for the village cats. It is an unprecedented man-made problem, which the military-backed governments and one-party states of mainland Southeast Asia are choosing to ignore as Beijing and financial institutions pour billions of dollars into hydroelectricity, which bring profit to the powerful few. According to the Stimson Center, the U.S. think tank, a cascade of dams in China and Laos is in the process of construction. By the time it has been completed, there will be 400 dams. Fish ladders were introduced into the river to help migrating fish to reach their upstream breeding grounds, but there is little evidence that these have worked. A report by Eyes on Earth has accused China of hoarding water. Beijing denies the charge, of course. Meanwhile, climate change has exacerbated the impact of the Indian Ocean dipole. Now, this is the scariest part of this whole story. Meanwhile, climate change has exacerbated the impact of the Indian Ocean dipole, a phenomenon similar to the El Niño weather pattern in the Pacific Ocean and sometimes known as the Indian Niño. This has meant unusually cooler than average sea surface temperatures across the eastern half of the Indian Ocean, and warmer water in the west cause floods in East Africa and drought in Southeast Asia. Looks like it's producing a double whammy. This phenomenon historically occurs once every 17.3 years, but scientists are forecasting its frequency will increase to once every 6.3 years over this century due to carbon emissions and excess energy in the atmosphere. I think that's rich. Weathermen can't seem to predict the weather a day ahead of time, and here they are predicting what's going to happen in the next 100 years. Continuing. Normally, at this time of year, the Tonle Sap Lake in Cambodia swells as floodwaters rise, then reverse course flowing back into the Mekong River. It's an unusual event that ties Khmer superstitions with harvest and prosperity. Sounds like what happened to the Mississippi River during the Madrid earthquakes back in 1815. Continuing. For the first time in living memory, that hasn't happened, and the usually sanguine Mekong River Commission has found its voice, forecasting that extreme drought is now expanding across northern Cambodia, southern Laos, and into central Vietnam. It described the plight of Tonle Sap as very critical, with water depths across the lower Mekong Basin below the minimum levels recorded in 1960 and 2019. The current low flows could have severe impacts on Cambodia due to a loss of fisheries and irrigation potential, said An Pik Hatna, Chief Executive of the MRC Secretariat in Vientiane, Laos. It is time to walk the talk and act in the common interest of the entire Mekong River Basin and the affected communities. That means a total rethink of how people live, what they eat, and where they call home. The dipole will reverse and floods are sure to follow, made all the worse by hoarding and too many upstream dams which would be forced to unleash torrents of water. Whether the generals and politicians like it or not, they have made a mess of the Mekong River. It's a sad thing. Swain's memoir is about to be made into a movie, and the author's own favorite line is, "I have never been able to stand on its tall banks and look down at its great sweep of moving water without the urge to go round the next bend to explore the wonders that may be in store." If those producers want to shoot on location, they might want to hurry up. Time is running out on the Mekong River. They may have to come over and shoot that movie on the mighty Mississippi River. It's still flowing. There it is, the story of what is happening to the mighty Mekong River of Southeast Asia. I'm sure Vietnam veterans who operated on or near the Mekong River are not happy about these developments. Again, I recommend you go over to the podcast website, episode 1817, and look at the picture of that river. It'll break your heart. And who do you have to thank for this catastrophic outcome on the Mekong River? It looks like you can lay most of the blame at the foot of the Chi-Coms. Those Chi-Coms seem to be doing all sorts of nasty things these days. They have the COVID virus 19. They're trying to take over the South China Sea. It looks like they're trying to take over the whole world. But it's time to stand up to them. It's going to be interesting to see if the world allows China to go ahead and build 400 dams on the Mekong River. When you look at this picture of the Mekong River, you wonder where they're going to get the water to fill up those 400 dams they plan to build. That's the latest on the once mighty Mekong River. Let's hope those people over there get it straightened out somehow and save that river. That's my opinion, and I'm sticking to it. This is Mac Payne closing out episode 1817 of the Vietnam Veteran News Podcast. Thank you so much for listening. You are cordially invited to return again soon and often, and tell your friends about it, to come back and listen to more of these stories that will be coming your way on this podcast, the Vietnam Veteran News.
How about that? Ain't that a mess?